Hi everyone. I'm going to be making a few video lessons for our course. Today's first lesson, first day as well. Wanted to just go over a couple things where to find notes and things like that. Hopefully, since you found this video, you've realized that I will be posting things in the news column. Each day, you're going to see a bit of a schedule there. Because we're doing e-learning, sometimes you may be a little bit behind the schedule, you may be a little bit ahead of the schedule, but I will be posting this each morning so that you're able to actually see what are we doing for that day. So orientation session, you hopefully made it to. I will be adding the video here so that if you need to go back and look at it, you can. You're also going to notice in this daily schedule, there's lots of little links. Could be things like the handout, could be things such as extra practice or so forth. So just keep aware of that, and I will be updating that each day so that you can keep on top of things. I've also shared with you this, which is the daily schedule. So as I was saying before, if you were, let's say, wanting to work ahead a little bit, you might be able to actually go into the next day's lessons and just see what's going on for there. You're also going to see on the side is information about due dates. So things that are handed in for marks. I've mentioned it right here if you read through. We are going to be using D2L to submit things. So again, those will pop up as links on our main news page. So when you first log into D2L, you're going to be on this course home, and that's where you're going to find that sort of daily information. So we're just aware of sort of these links and clicking into them to find things. So for now, we're actually going to start. I'm going to jump ahead of the course introduction. Hopefully you guys were able to do a little bit of that stuff on your own. I'm going to jump over here to the lesson one. So there's a couple different resources I'll just bring your attention to here. One is this part of the link. So when I open this, it should hopefully bring you into either a slide deck presentation. Sometimes it'll be a PDF of the lessons and so forth. So that should open it up for you. I'm just going to click back for one quick sec here. You might also want to, and it's up to you, is to write on a handout. So I know for me, I like to write things down on paper. You're welcome to print these out if you want, or you can make a copy in your Google Drive and take notes. That's what I would recommend doing. So when I clicked on handout here, I'm going to see just a blank a handout sheet. So just like you would have a photocopy of this in school, for example, we have a similar thing for e-learning. The other thing I'll just briefly point out while we're here is you're going to notice up here, click for access to all unit handouts. So as I said before, you might be wanting to work ahead, or you might just want to see what the topics are that we're going to be looking at. If you open up this folder, and you can just add it to your own drive if you like, there's lots of info in here. Most of the lessons are here. A lot of the homework will be in here and so forth. So you're welcome to use that link as we go through as well. So back to today's lesson, which is on classification of organisms. This is a really good start to the course. This unit is called Diversity of Living Things. So while we're going through this unit, what we're aiming to do is to look at all the different kingdoms of life. So usually by grade 10 science, you've really only tapped into animals and plants, but there's actually many millions and millions more species out there beyond just animals and plants. So that's really what this unit is aiming to do. And we will finish the unit talking about plants and animals, but they're not the main focus necessarily of this unit. I'll just bring up and pull up the slide deck here. There are a few videos that I'm asking you to watch. So you're welcome to just pause my video if you'd like to kind of stop halfway and watch them. I'll be touching upon what information is posted there. The first slide of this slide deck is just meant to be something for you to think about. I have mentioned here, I would love if you could go over to the D2L forum and share your ideas about these different topics. So I'm going to let you do that on your own. And then hopefully we get a good discussion going within the D2L discussion forum. I'll just show you briefly where that is in case you missed the orientation session. When I scroll to the top, I will see discussions. And I've tried to organize it in sort of like the units. So we are in unit one. we will find lesson discussions here, and you'll notice that there are multiple topics. So of course, we're like on the first day, benefits of naming and grouping living things, and there are some other kind of questions within here as well. So hopefully you are able to navigate to here and you're able to add your responses there. So that we'll be using that frequently, and like I mentioned, I've sort of organized it by lesson so that you can come in here and write your thoughts down. So back to here, I'm going to let you all think about these different concepts and hopefully add to our discussion. I'll ask you to watch this video on your own. So I'll just sort of discuss the video, but if you'd like to, you can pause me and watch the video. What this video talks about is the importance of learning about other organisms. So it's very obvious why we should learn about humans, mainly for our health and our own well-being. But this unit, as I mentioned before, it focuses on the greater picture. It focuses on all these different areas of life, many of which are still very unknown to us. So as you watch this video, you may be thinking to yourself, oh, that's strange. Like, why am I learning about a worm, for example? Well, one of the reasons is that many of these organisms outside of humans and actually outside of animals even, they're doing really, really cool things that we would like to learn more about so we can use them for human health and for different purposes. So one example that he uses in this video is when you cut up certain organisms like a worm into many, many little pieces, you actually can watch them regenerate the entire rest of their body, which for humans we know we cannot do. Okay, we have obviously ability to repair ourselves, but we can't just grow a new human if we were to take off a part of ourselves. So there's huge potential there for us to tap into that biological information and use it for our own benefit. So if, for example, we did have someone who had a failing organ, we might have the capacity and we might be able to actually regenerate an organ for someone. So it has really, really huge implications. We're watching as these organisms are doing really, really cool things that humans cannot do. It's just not things we've evolved to do. So just something to think about while you're watching this video is, why do we learn about things aside from just humans? So I'll let you watch that and sort of think about that on your own a little bit more. At this point, this is where we would really start lesson notes. So I was mentioning before, there's that handout that I've also attached. I would use that as sort of a guide, and whether you like to write the notes on there or you want to type them up or whatnot, I would recommend doing that just to keep everything organized. So a little bit of practice here. If you were asked to classify, which is just another term for grouping, imagine you had to group these different things into two separate groups and title each one. So an apple, pea, orange, banana, carrot, lettuce, turnip, pear, grape, potato. So think about what two groups you would put those objects in. So many of you are probably thinking, obviously, I would put them into vegetables and fruit. Okay, that is sort of like my first reaction to this as well. I'm going to encourage you to think about, is there another way that you could organize these into two groups? One example I'll share with you for just something to think about, I could group them by shape. For example, things that are spherical, things that are non-spherical. That separates them into two groups. I could organize them into things that grow on a tree, things that do not grow on a tree. Likewise, does it grow under the soil, under the ground, or does it grow above the ground? And with that in mind, we can kind of go on and on and on thinking about ways to group these into two separate groups. And what I want you thinking about is, what is the usefulness of actually doing that? So I'm going to backtrack to my first comment, which is I could do this with vegetables and fruits. And thinking about, why would I even bother to do that? If you even think of just something really simple like going to the grocery store, and if you think of like the aisles in the grocery store or like how it's organized, well, it makes sense just for efficiency that if I'm looking for fruits or vegetables, I'm going to look in those sort of aisles of the grocery store where I would find those. I wouldn't go to, let's say, the cereal aisle looking for grapes, right? So organizing things into groups is very helpful with that. So I'm going to ask you to do the same activity on your own with this second one, which is now trying to organize them into three different groups. So you can try that on your own too, and just think about why we would actually do that. And that brings me to my following point, which may or may not be new to you, which is how does this relate to biology? So in biology, we actually do that with species, we do that with living things. So taxonomy is the science of identifying and classifying all organisms. So a really easy one, like we were saying before, would be plants and animals, right? That's two separate groups. Now, unfortunately, with that, as I mentioned, that actually excludes a lot of other living things. So that would not be a great way to classify something. But I mentioned right here, it's not as easy as recognizing just different species. So an apple and an orange, very clearly different things. Dog and a cat, very clearly different things. Where it becomes more interesting and more challenging is for things that look really similar to one another, or things that are very, very small. So the example I've put here is in Ontario alone, there are 50 types of mosquitoes. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see a mosquito, I really don't know the difference between one species and the next. Unless you've studied that or you're an expert on that, you really wouldn't know. Taxonomy, though, is actually the work or the study of putting those into each of their separate groups. So that is a main thing that we're going to be discussing in this lesson. And I've given a couple more examples there as well, things that we wouldn't necessarily think to classify. They have very subtle differences between them. They are actually different. So those differences are what we're discussing today. So a couple of issues or challenges. I mentioned before, some species look really similar to each other. So those 50 types of mosquitoes, for example, with the naked eye, most of us cannot tell the difference between them. A second problem that makes it difficult to classify things is that even within a species, there are members who look different or who might act different from one another. So I mentioned right here different genders. So male and female, we see this a lot in birds, but we also see it across the animal kingdom. But with birds, red cardinal is the male, looks very different from the female. And so, what makes that difficult for classification is that I might look at these and say, these are two different species. They're obviously different from each other. However, they can interbreed. They can breed with each other. They can produce offspring. And so that tells us that actually they are the same species biologically. So we wouldn't want to separate them. They actually are a shared species. So something to think about. As well, individuals change in appearance as they age. So if I found a tadpole in a stream and then I found a frog on land, I might look at those and say, wow, these are really different from each other. They must be a different species. But again, it turns out they're actually the same species. So these are something that taxonomists need to be aware of. And last but not least, depending on where you are, the species can look very different. And this has to do with evolution, which is also the third point. We're going to do a whole unit on evolution in unit 3. So we've got a little bit of time before that. But depending where I find these organisms, they're going to be differently adapted to their environment. So they're going to look different and perhaps behave differently. So that's something for us to keep in mind as well. This evolution one, I'm not going to talk much about it right now because, like I said, we have a whole focus on that later. But if I found fossils of something and was comparing it to a modern day a species that's still living, I would perhaps think they're different species or the same species. That might not be the case. And we'll discuss later why that might be. So a little bit of history. This person is called Carl Linnaeus, and we call him the father of taxonomy. He's the one that really started creating a consistent way to group things together. And he started by grouping them by physical morphological similarities. Those two words are interchangeable. And his sort of like claim to fame is this way of naming species called binomial nomenclature. And so I always think of it like math, where I see binomial, it means two terms. And nomenclature just means a system for naming things. So I'm going to discuss more about what a species is just in a minute or two, but that's sort of where his ideas are coming from. We're going to talk about the usefulness of that soon. So what we have with binomial nomenclature is a name that uses two words. So one is called the genus, one is called the specific name, sometimes called the specific epithet. So together, those form what we call the scientific binomial species name. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples here. Sorry, I'll just zoom out so that you can see it. A polar bear and a black bear, okay? They're obviously different from each other, and they are different species actually because they can't productively breed together. So that is one of the definitions of a species. Are they able to actually breed in nature and produce viable living offspring? And we will find that these two cannot necessarily do that. Now, what I want to notice and what I want to point out here, these three that I've chosen, they're all called bears. But if you look closely, you're going to see that the polar bear and the black bear have something in common, which is this word ursus. That represents the genus, and I'm going to speak to genus in a few minutes. If we look at the koala bear, its first name, its genus name, is not ursus, it's something different. And that tells me that actually this koala bear is very much unlike the polar bear and the black bear. Okay, there's going to be way less similarities between the koala bear and the others. These two are more closely related. They belong to what we call the same genus. So a little bit more about that in just a minute or two. A couple of notes I just wanted to put in is that we have sort of like a pattern for how we name this. So similar to chemistry, how there's sort of like rules to follow. So with binomial names, and these are like scientific names, we always rate the genus first and we capitalize it. The specific epithet or specific name is always lowercase, both of them in italics. And the last one here, I find we use this a lot actually, is the abbreviation or the short form. So if I'm talking about Homo sapiens, humans, sometimes you'll see it in articles or in the textbook or whatnot, short form. So H with a little period and then sapiens. So it refers to Homo sapiens, just making it a little bit more short form. Now, I have a little activity here for you guys to do. You can pause my video while you do it. I want you to think of two species or two organisms that you think are similar, okay? The example that I used was American crocodile and American alligator. They look kind of the same, so I chose two that look alike, okay? Now, what I want you to do is to Google those two things. Google those two things, and what you might type in my example, is American crocodile species name. Excuse me. And then what might pop up is this. So this is what represents the binomial name. So you're going to go back and you're going to say, okay, this is the name for the crocodile. Now I want the American alligator species name. Okay, and then something else will pop up here. What I was saying before, and the point I was trying to make, is that I noticed that these two first words are different. What this means is we have two different genuses. okay? That means that they are not that closely related. They're not the same species. So I want you to try that. You can pause my video and try that on your own with two things that you think are pretty similar. You're going to basically verify that, okay? Now, I want to just define another term for you, which is called taxa. Taxa is just a fancy way of naming a group. So I mentioned one type of taxa just earlier, which is the genus. So the genus represents an example of a taxa. It's a group. So I've used a couple of these words before. We're going to see it on the next slide. We have things called species and genus, which I mentioned earlier. I also said something about kingdom. Kingdom being like, are you part of the animal kingdom? Are you part of the plant kingdom? And so forth. So I want to just explain to you why I've put this image here. This image is essentially a pyramid of organizing organisms. So species has the fewest members. In other words, a domain will have the largest number of members. So to give you an example of a domain, what we're talking about in domains essentially is eukaryotes and prokaryotes. So you probably learned in grade 10, eukaryotes are those organisms that have a nucleus, a real nucleus. Prokaryotes are those organisms that don't have a nucleus. So an example of what I'm talking about here, if I think about all eukaryotes, okay, that would include every type of plant and animal, as well as every type of fungi and protist. We haven't even gotten to those yet, but we'll talk about them in this unit. So the domains include a lot of members. Okay, that's a really general taxa. That's a very broad classification. As I move down this pyramid to species, that includes very few members. So if I'm thinking of plants, right, there's many, many types of plants. But if I focus just on one type, let's say pine trees, that is a very small number of members. That's a very small number of organisms. So with this guy here, I have a little trick to remember sort of the order. I'm going to write it in here for you if you'd like it. But if I want to remember the order, domain is the broadest, species is the most specific. One way to do that is like a little mnemonic. So, for example, I use the mnemonic did King Philip come over for good soup? Okay, so basically the first letter of each of these represents the domain, kingdom, phylum, and so forth going down the list. So again, we were talking about genus just earlier. Well, genus is including sort of anyone that's related to each other more closely. So we use the example of the polar bear and the black bear. I'm going to mention one thing here. I've used the word species a lot. Now, a species is a little bit of a gray area, but how we typically define it, and I'm going to write it on here so you can include it in your notes if you'd like, but a species, really what it is, are organisms that can breed freely in nature and produce viable offspring. And you're going to hear me use that word viable. It means essentially that those offspring can actually survive as well as themselves reproduce. And we're going to come back to the species concept again later on. It's a very important concept in this course. So I wanted to just give a couple of examples here. Here I have a classification animal between humans, Homo sapiens, and honeybees. So what I've done is actually list on the side all the different taxons. These just mean all the different groups. So what I'm trying to prove by doing this is to say we actually do share the same kingdom. We're both animals, but really after that point, we very much differ from each other. So, for example, humans are chordates. That means we have a spinal cord. We're going to talk about that later. Honeybees are part of the phylum Arthropods. And really, after that point, we become very, very different. So we're not going to have the same genus or family or order and so forth if we don't even have the same phylum. We become very much different from each other. Now, if I was, for example, instead of a honeybee, looking at a different organism, let's say I was looking at a pig, I'm just choosing that. Well, pigs, they are also animals. They are also chordates. They are also mammals. But after that point, we become different from pigs. So there's countless examples of this, but hopefully in the next activity that we do, you guys will actually be able to research some of this information about different animals and organisms. But what we use it for is grouping. Okay, so trying to find similarities and differences between things. So I wanted to just go back to domains quickly. I had mentioned that we typically use the ideas of prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So here you'll see eukarya. Eukarya being all of the eukaryotic organisms. So anyone that has a nucleus will be considered a eukarya. So that includes all the plants, all the animals, all the fungi, and all the protists. And then over here, these bacteria and archaea, these are considered prokaryotic groups. And the reason why they're split into two is that actually over time we've realized these two groups are actually very different from each other. So we've created just a whole domain for each of them. So a little bit more about that afterward when we actually get to bacteria and archaea. But I'll just add on to that is we now use what's called the six kingdom system. So throughout this particular unit, we're going to be going through all of these in detail, okay? Some of which you might know very little about as of now. Things like the animal and the plants, we tend to know more about it. But we have bacteria, archaebacteria, protists, plants, fungi, and animals, which we're going to be going over shortly. So that brings us to this. This is like the big tree of life, and it does not contain nearly enough organisms that it should, but it's just to show you that we actually are all connected in some way, which we're going to start talking about as time goes on. So each of these colors essentially represents a different kingdom of life, which we are currently using is a six kingdom system. Now, what I'll ask you to do is to watch this video. I think it reviews really nicely the concepts that we've talked about here. Totally optional, but you can also fill in this handout while you watch, which is just to make sure that you're getting the information. So I'll leave that part with you. If you need it as well, and sort of optional, but I think useful, is this eukaryote versus prokaryote video. I did post this as well onto the daily schedule, so if you've already done it, that's great. It's really just to get you thinking about those different kingdoms that fall under prokaryote and eukaryote. So on that note, I'm going to let you go here. If you have any questions, I will encourage you to go over to the discussion forum in D2L and post your question there so that I can answer it, and hopefully it actually helps other people to understand the material as well. So thank you for sticking with me. I know this is a bit of a longer video. We're not going to have super long videos each time. This one just take a little bit longer so I can show you around the D2L classroom. So hopefully you're able to find your way for future lessons.